We want to thank you all for joining our Ask an Auditor live session featuring guest audit firm Securisea. We are focusing on FedRAMP today and have some great questions come in that we look forward to answering. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question when registering, feel free to add it to our Q&A section, and we'll answer it as long as time allows. Moderating today's session is your audit zone Troy Fine. He's a Director of Compliance Advisory Services and a former auditor himself. Thanks for being here, Troy.
Thanks, Jacob. Glad to be here. And I'm also glad to be introducing Josh Daymont. Josh is the founder and CEO of Securisea. They are a broadly accredited cybersecurity assurance firm. Their various wholly owned subsidiaries are authorized to issue a wide array of assurance products. And these groups' various practices, they include FedRAMP 3PAO, they have a CPA firm, they're a high trust external assessor, ISO certification body, and a PCI practice as qualified to issue over 8 different PCI assessment types, including P2PE and 3DS. So they have a lot of experience here, and I'm glad to have you on, Josh. Anything you want to add there before we get started?
Thank you, Troy. I just wanted to express my appreciation both to you and Drada for having me on. This is absolutely wonderful. Just a little bit more about myself. I came into compliance and assurance through vulnerability research, and we also have quite a healthy vulnerability research practice as well, but not what we're here to talk about. Go ahead, Troy.
Yeah, no, we're here to talk about our favorite topic, FedRAMP, right? It's everybody's favorite topic. It's so easy to understand, and there's never any confusion. So hopefully we can a half hour, 25 minutes to eliminate all that confusion for everybody. So let's just get started. So obviously at Drada, we focus on SOC 2, ISO 27001, PCI, but many of our customers focus on SOC 2 initially, right? It's kind of like it's how they get into compliance, right? So a key question we always get is, what are the key differences between FedRAMP and SOC 2? And I know that's a loaded question, but I'm curious, how you would describe those key differences.
That is a simple but brilliant question in so many ways. And there's actually a lot to cover there. So I appreciate that question. There are tremendous differences. I'll start with some of the more important ones. And first, let me acknowledge that from the point of view of an implementer or the subject of the engagement, a lot of times, despite these differences, it can kind of feel the same. It is really the same audit or assessment process. It's going to be the same interviews or the same interview formats and the same sort of evidence collection and all of the things that Drada customers understand and have experienced. However, in terms of the formal constitution of these two engagement types and the requirements on the auditor or assessor, they really are tremendously different. So to start, the SOC 2 engagement is defined by the AICPA, and it is essentially a standard that places requirements immediately on a CPA firm in terms of what that CPA firm must do to issue an attestation report. A SOC 2 is an attestation report. And therefore, the formality or the sort of obligations of the customer, the subject, flow through the audit firm. For FedRAMP, it's completely different. For FedRAMP, which is the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program, for those of you who like acronyms, I guess, the obligations are enshrined in law by the government, and they obligate cloud service providers or CSPs who want to sell cloud services to the federal government to get this. And then they must go to a 3PAO, which of course Securisea is, and many other about 40 organizations in the world are, to then pass a FedRAMP assessment. But the obligations fundamentally are legally required or legally placed on the actual customer, as opposed to the customers choosing to get this like a SOC 2 because they want to sell more or their customers are demanding it. Let me also acknowledge, for every, auditing and compliance is like anything else in life, right? There's always an exception, or there's always sort of an asterisk, right? So many companies do choose to get FedRAMP even if they haven't been asked yet. And there's a special FedRAMP assessment type called FedRAMP Ready, which is designed to allow companies who want to gain the marketing and the sales benefits in the federal space, but might not yet have a contract in hand that obligates them to get this. Let me also just mention a very important difference. And if you have a senior or a very experienced assessor on the FedRAMP side, this will become apparent to most subjects or most companies undergoing these audits. SOC 2, these scoping rules are really around the service, right? The service organization and what the service commitments are to market customers. That makes perfect sense if you're a CPA or you're trying to control what is being sold. For FedRAMP, much like PCI, the scoping requirements are around an authorization boundary, and that authorization boundary is defined by the presence of federal data, which then will have certain requirements around handling and security that will map to various federal laws and regulations. And so what happens is for SOC, there's not as much distinction about making sure that out of scope systems and out of scope services are not are in fact out of scope, because simply they're declared out of scope in the attestation report. For FedRAMP, it's a bit different. The assessor is going to have to show that there is total isolation between what's inside the authorization boundary and what's outside the authorization boundary, and that there's no federal data that's outside of that area. There's a variety of other differences in terms of control structure. FedRAMP is more prescriptive. SOC is less prescriptive. I could talk quite a while about this subject, but if there's follow-on questions or more specific questions, maybe we would address those during the open part of the session. Troy, did I cover it?
Yeah, no, that was good. I mean, we could probably spend the whole 30 minutes discussing the differences between the two, but I think you hit on, I mean, the key one that right is one is government oriented and one is really just a nonprofit organization developing standards, right? So just in that, there's big differences, right? When you work with government, they have a lot more strict rules. Things are going to move slower. There's a lot less leeway, there's a lot more approvals that need to be done. You have to define your boundary. Like you said, it's based on certain types of data that the government wants protected. Where, like you said, SOC 2 is more open-ended, right? You can define your own attestation boundary. It's not really tied to specific data. Sometimes it's tied to customer data, but what is customer data? Like it's totally open-ended, and that creates a lot of confusion for SOC 2. So in a sense, FedRAMP is less confusing from that perspective, right? Because it's more defined and the controls are more defined. Where SOC 2 is really open-ended and people don't know where to start because it doesn't really tell you where to start. But once you're started, it's usually easier than to get FedRAMP for obvious reasons. But yeah, I think you covered that well.
I think you hit on a tremendous point, Troy. And if I could just mention one last thing based on your comment. We often hear from our SOC 2 clients, well, why can't it just tell me what I'm supposed to do? Why do I have to decide what I'm going to do and what my controls are? In FedRAMP, it's the opposite. Why are they making me do it exactly this way? Why do we have to fit into this narrowest of narrow requirements? And so I really wanted to emphasize your point there. That was brilliant.
Yeah. They're definitely two extremes. But yeah, like I said, we could talk all day. But the next question, at least I get a lot. Do you have to be deployed in GovCloud in order to be FedRAMP authorized? And if not, where can you be deployed?
That is a great question. We hear that as well. The short answer is no, you don't have to be deployed in GovCloud. Unless, let me say it depends, unless you want to be FedRAMP High, in which case you would have to be deployed in GovCloud. There are other cases where you might be obligated to be deployed there. For example, that you might not be high, and this is very, very rare. I will tell you, you might not be going for FedRAMP High, but you might have certain data types that just happen to require GovCloud for reasons that are too specific to get into on this call. But no, you don't.
And then a follow-up question to that.
Okay.
Some of our large, one person was asking that some of their large customers, they're going through FedRAMP, and I guess there may be an external service provider to them. Those details weren't provided, or maybe they're part of their boundary, but they're asking, I have a lot of customers going for FedRAMP, and they've asked us to deploy our service in AWS GovCloud. Is there anything we should be wary about or things we should know when starting down this path of using AWS GovCloud? Good and bad, I guess.
Yep. I wish maybe we had this person here, but so there's a key difference between is this a request that's coming from a private organization that has their own FedRAMP authorization and is asking this particular vendor or company to be in GovCloud as a private organization, compared to is there an agency authorizing official, which is a very specific FedRAMP term, which was a federal employee who's ultimately responsible for the authorization decision. Is that individual asking them to go into GovCloud? And that's a very, very different situation depending on who's asking. But to go to the other part of the question, it's very interesting. Should you be worried about going into GovCloud? And the answer is sometimes yes. A primary difference or a primary challenge that companies have when they go into GovCloud is that not only is GovCloud run entirely by United States citizens, but customers, vendor, people who use it, then sign a follow-on agreement that essentially says that they will only permit United States citizens to access this GovCloud system. Now, if you look at H-1 visas, if you look at the workplace that we have today with remote work, with offshoring, there have been companies that have gone into GovCloud and realized after the fact, perhaps after an acquisition or a merger, that they thought they were just going to benefit from GovCloud, and they were doing it because it was optional, and they've really sort of realized that maybe they should have gone into US East or US West. If you have to be in GovCloud, it's simple, you go in. If you don't, you should think very carefully about what you need and whether or not it's required. On the flip side of that, if you believe, and we've had these conversations with clients as well, if right now you only need moderate impact because of your data type, but you believe you're going to be FedRAMP high in 2-3 years, sometimes you really do want to go into GovCloud, only because you don't want to have to tear down your entire environment and move it in 3 years after you've built it once. It's probably more complex at that point. That would just be a lot of work. So it is by no means an open and shut decision. There's a lot of trade-offs, and it's something that every company should consider very carefully and probably talk to an expert about their specific circumstances.
Yeah, and I think it also, if you have multiple customers telling you to do this and there's an ROI, then it becomes a business decision as well, right? So there are documents you can read in the government about what type of data you have and which impact level you are, but sometimes that's not very straightforward and you can't really tell all the time. So I would recommend to this person to always reach out, ask your customer a lot of these questions, right? What type of data are we? High impact data based on the data you're providing us? Are we low impact, medium impact, because moderate impact? Because like you said, you really only have to be in GovCloud if you're high impact or if you have other requirements such as other types of data. But your customer should be able to tell you that. Why are they requiring this? Especially if your customer is the government, they will definitely know. But if it's a third party to the government and you're a fourth party, that'll be a fun conversation to have. But I would always start with asking your customers these questions, and they should be able to answer them. If they can't, then why are they asking you in the first place? Would be so.
Exactly. And quick pro tip, if you're in these conversations as a company and you're talking to your counterparty, your prospective customer, one thing you might ask them is, what is the FIPS 199 treatment of the data? And that is the document, Federal Information Protection Standard number 199, that's going to eventually govern the impact level and your FedRAMP, basically impact level. Go ahead.
Yeah. And we are actually getting a lot of good questions. So I'm gonna ask one that I think is interesting because we've been hearing a lot about state ramp and text ramp. So somebody asked, what is the difference between FedRAMP and text ramp and the Texas specific purchasing program?
Oh, wow. Okay, good one. Because just for background, we are both a FedRAMP 3PAO as well as a StateRAMP 3PAO, and we've done both assessments. We have clients under both. And I also am individually in my capacity a FedRAMP and StateRAMP assessor, senior assessor. Let me, there's tremendous differences. So FedRAMP was created by federal law, by an act of Congress, signed by the executive branch. I believe it was Obama originally, and we already covered that. StateRAMP is actually a nonprofit organization that initially was not mandated by any state law. There were states were starting to mandate things sort of similar to FedRAMP, and an organization saw an opportunity to sort of become the central clearinghouse, and they did an excellent job, and we're big supporters of them. But to create, to fulfill that need, right? And it's worked out really well so far. We work with some very large entities that sell a lot of services to the state, and I can tell you that normally, compliance is not associated with efficiency or like reduction of workload. But if you've ever sold to state government, any sort of consolidation of state regulations into one central area is definitely going to make your life easier. That is for sure. I don't. There's no doubt in my mind about that. So this is a private organization, and essentially they have mirrored in a lot of ways what FedRAMP does, but they make it applicable to states, and they're very cooperative with the state governments. Texas has a Department of Information, DIR. I forget the exact acronym. Texas has been very proactive in terms of creating a Texas-based program that is compatible with StateRAMP. Last I had understood from Texas state government, if you were StateRAMP, you automatically had TexRAMP. I believe for FedRAMP it might actually be the same, but they're so similar it doesn't really matter. And then if you're only Texas and you just want to comply with the Texas state laws, there's a Texas specific program. What we're seeing is that most companies are going for StateRAMP, but TexRAMP is a great program. Their system is much, how should I put it, substantially more mature than the typical state government program for StateRAMP.
So TexRAMP, I always thought TexRAMP was kind of part of StateRAMP, but it's kind of like it's its own version of FedRAMP that's actually different than StateRAMP, correct?
It is different.
Maybe they work together, but
think about it like it started to become like USB, right? Like they're all come from different companies and they operate slightly differently, but you can kind of plug one into the other. So if you have StateRAMP, you have and again, check with your Texas AO, check with your Texas buyer, because they may or may not. We have heard different things out of different arms of the state government there, or the Republic of Texas, depending on if you live in Texas or not. That by and large, if you are StateRAMP, you've got no concerns. It's just sort of like a form, like a portability form. But yes, it is different. Florida, California, Arizona, Massachusetts have, I don't know, I would say as sort of comprehensive as Texas is probably the most comprehensive. But all of these states have sort of seen the need to have state enforcement, right, of IT security for their cloud service providers, just like the federal government does. And while they're all increasingly subscribing to the StateRAMP standard for efficiency and uniformity, and frankly, you benefit from that because people who sell to California tend to also sell to other states and vice versa. The enforcement, and they're not about to delegate their state legal authority to a nonprofit that is independent of them.
Yeah, and that person said Texas government's actually helping them get certified. They haven't committed or authorized, but they haven't committed to doing it yet.
DIR has really stepped up and been proactive about being easy to work with and trying to make a positive difference their
Yeah.
sellers. Yeah.
And somebody asked, it says, what's the difference between FedRAMP and FedRAMP High? I think you left out the word moderate. So we're going to assume you're asking what is the difference between FedRAMP Moderate and FedRAMP High? Maybe like a few key high level points here, because we'll probably get to a couple more after this.
Yeah. So, so there's four essentially types of FedRAMP assessments. There's FedRAMP low impact SaaS tailored, which is the bare minimum. And that's based on being in a FedRAMP authorized public specific list of FedRAMP authorized public cloud providers. Then there's FedRAMP low, which is probably the least used of any, but they do exist. And then there's FedRAMP moderate, which is, I would say, probably the most used, right? Most, unless you're dealing with very minimal data, you are probably going to end up being FedRAMP moderate. And FedRAMP moderate is, FedRAMP high is basically about 3 times the number of controls as FedRAMP moderate. If you talk about the key difference, FedRAMP high. If you talk about the key difference at FedRAMP high, only US citizens can really work on the system. Now, there's 3 times the controls. However, there's significant overlap in terms of what those controls are. So there's a substantially larger audit impact. There's a substantially larger documentation impact. What we have seen is that outside of having to move into GovCloud, while there's significant amounts of work that go into it, no one has had to, for the organizations that we've seen go from moderate to high, no one has had to like completely redo their systems. No one has had to completely rebuild from scratch any applications or databases or networks. The US citizen requirement certainly has been has driven substantial differences in how applications are built and managed at certain companies. And then on top of that, I would say I wouldn't discount that when you're FedRAMP high, even if you're going to see a lot more scrutiny from the federal government, and that should not be discounted. That is a real difference.
Yeah, theoretically speaking, you have higher impact data, so that actually makes sense. I'll give the government that one. Good, that low, moderate, high impact, that makes sense to me. That's something I understand. I do want to get to one question that was asked earlier that comes up a lot, and I think a lot of our companies, especially engineers on this call or CTOs on this call, thinking about FedRAMP, they always think about do I have to re-architect anything? So one question was, does FedRAMP allow for multi-tenant environments that host commercial and government customers in the same environment, or do you have to have isolation there?
Very interesting. And you will get different answers for this within the federal government. Let me just say that. And realize that if you're doing an agency authorization as opposed to a JAB authorization, you will see different requirements at different federal agencies. I don't want to name any federal agencies, but let's just say there are differing perspectives. So to get back to the question, FedRAMP scope is defined by an authorization boundary. We have not seen anything in FedRAMP that says you cannot have corporate data in your authorization boundary. So in that respect, you might say yes. However, if you were to have federal data and then corporate data for other corporate non-federal customers, it sort of begs the question of, are all those other customers of yours, are they FedRAMPed? Are they treating their access to the authorization boundary in a manner that is consistent with FedRAMP? And if one of them had a security incident, would the FedRAMP compliance umbrella cover those relationships as well? That tends to be a very difficult thing for a client to show for agencies and for situations where that's important. Now, if we're talking LI SaaS, I can see, if you look on the FedRAMP marketplace, you'll see a lot of LI SaaS companies that probably have multi-tenant and have corporate and FedRAMP data mixed. If you're talking on the high side, I would personally doubt it. Now, let me give you the chief example where for sure there's multi-tenant data corporate and federal, that's on the same physical hardware. And that's all three of the major public cloud providers, right? And all three of them, for their non-high environments, certainly have non-federal systems and federal systems, and they're managing it all under a single set of infrastructure. And so anyone says that it can never, ever, ever happen, well, there's your example of it happening.
Yeah.
This is one of the questions where I would say anyone who's facing this question really should talk to a 3PAO. There's not going to be one specific answer that's going to apply. It's a discussion, and I would say this is the level of question that really.
Oh, we might have lost you, Josh.
Organization
Oh,
to chime in.
there you go.
Oh, are you?
No,
Is
you're
everyone okay
back.
with the
You're
video?
back. Thought we lost you there. Yeah, you're good. You're good. Yeah, we got that most answer, and we're at the half-hour limit anyways. But yeah, no, it's been really good, and we got a lot of questions here. So, we'll take a look at the ones we didn't get to, and we'll provide responses where we can. But Josh, just wanted to thank you for being on, and I'm gonna hand it back over to Jacob real quick to close us out.
Awesome job, guys. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. And a big thank you to Josh from Securisea and Troy for sharing his expertise. We'll be sending out a recording of the webinar, so keep an eye out for that. If you have any more questions, don't hesitate to reach out as well. Also, we'll be having a webinar on Wednesday, July 26th with audit firm Gills Norton and virtual CISO Eden Data. It's called SOC 2 Year 2 and Beyond. And we'll focus on the competitive advantage of continuous compliance. So please join us for that, and we'll see you guys next time.